Mariela Neagu of Oxford Research. Honestly, this is such a pleasure again to have you, and it's unfortunate we got cut off right there, but now we got a part two to work on. And we were talking about uh, a central database potentially that can be open sourced so that people could create research. And take off where we uh, had those issues.
Yeah, well, there is an institution which is the Institute for the Study of Crimes During Communism, and I think that perhaps could be a start. Um, I think that's something, yeah, we you could raise from your perspective. I um, I
Based
have
on
done
precedent.
I have done recently a program with a researcher from there who looked into um, yeah sort of orphanage crisis or the humanitarian aid in Romania in the 1990s, and so I know there is some work which has been happening. It's just that I don't think it has looked into that this area necessarily of adoption. They looked into, yeah.
And I don't bring it up because I'm like, I want to go get people. I want to create problems. I want to stir things up. I want people to go to jail. No, it's nothing like that. I think when something this extreme happens, it's a learning opportunity, just like the Holocaust was, for people to investigate things that have occurred. We can look at Armenian genocide, South Africa, Rwanda. There needs to be some sort of uh, educational proponent and involved in developing a working educational model for not just Romanian people, but uh, the world to have. And the working model would be something that can lay down a moral fabric in a society through that educational means. It doesn't mean that you have
Mm.
to go after people. It just means the the initiative is there to kind of gauge what it is that it happened and
Hmm.
how society and the world can respond to any crisis that is similar in the future.
I think it's a healing exercise, like you say. It's not, yeah, it's something which we need to look at in order to be able to go further as a people, as you know, um, being okay with each other, and yeah, I agree. I don't think we'll be able to get maybe to um, the bottom of it, but I think we time has an incredible power because it gives us the opportunity to reflect. It's not only children growing up, it's also those who are adults getting older and hopefully wiser.
And they raise a generation of children that are raising another generation of children now. So when people experience extreme circumstances, it formulates how they're going to raise the next generation. And as you had mentioned earlier in part one, that beating children was a common thing that people did, and it was a acceptable cultural approach, not just in Romania, but around the world. So when we look at the lessons and the ethical construct of Romanian society today, we can directly go back to extreme circumstances as you can in any sphere of life, political, you name it. And those extreme experiences desensitize or sensitize people to the way that they're going to respond and react to their
Mm.
environment, which is a direct uh, in my opinion, it's directly impacted the way Romanian society currently uh, operates with a lack of social structures for the everyday person, and a lack of community amongst the individuals that are living in Romania who may need those supports. You walk down the street in Romania, you're going to see somebody that is homeless and begging. It's just, and you
Mm.
don't see that in many countries that have that sense of fabric that has been built up. In particular, if you look at the Israeli Society for Their Own People, they will fund and take care of people through their religious environments and so on. You don't have that in Romania, even though it's such a extreme Orthodox, not extreme, but like it's an Orthodox culture that is actually quite religious. And I kind of wonder on your end
I would
how to
frame it
do
a
that.
bit differently than you
Okay.
did in my experiences. Yeah. So how I see things, well, for me, the thing with homelessness and begging, I live in Oxford, and it's quite a number of people who are homeless and who are begging in the streets. So it's not that. I think there is a sense of community in mostly in Romania. I think where I see the fracture is between people and institutions. Uh, I think how people, and when I say institutions, it's not only state institutions. I think people who are in power, the way they look at those who are disempowered, who are vulnerable, who are poor, and I think the way they are treated, they have been treated, has been appalling. Um, Not only because we've discussed this quite sensitive issue of you know uh, children being taken into care or being taken and sent abroad, or mother being cheated to put their signature on the adoption paper without fully understanding what they're doing, so all that. But then, so we had children mistreated by, sometimes by professionals, or in any case by people with some power before 1999. And in that circumstances of oppression and fear and secret police, then we had not children, people being manipulated in the 1990s. Then we had the Romanian people going abroad, living, trying to make a living, um, going to work in agriculture in Europe, leaving their children behind, and then uh, the story became that they abandoned their children, whereas they actually left their children with extended family members. Again, that was in the way they were um called, the strawberry pickers, in a sort of demeaning way for people who are actually hardworking, trying to get things right. And I know several young people who grew up, with their parents, and one is was part of the study, um, who emigrated and who don't like that narrative in the media and profoundly disagree with it. Now, what we got, then the people left together with the children, they kind of try to see how it works, if it works for them, if they could bring their families. Then a lot of them actually left with the children. What we have now in Romania is deserted villages, closed schools, many of them, hundreds of them, and yeah, I think it's a pretty desolate image,
And
which
what do
comes
you
from this foolishness of how you look as a politician, as a leader, how, as somebody who represents an institution, how you look at the others as part of a greater family. Sorry.
and you're kind of hinting at a sense of accountability for action, and there obviously you were in the European Union, in Brussels there was a huge movement for Romanians to start taking funding and start utilizing resources that are progressive for the society, and nobody was taking those resources. So it was because there's a lack of initiative inside the country and a lack of desire to have accountability because you guys were going to hold people accountable to for their budgets, their grant money, their where it goes and what they do with it. And I
Brendan,
wonder
I wouldn't even start that discussion. I think it's so, yeah, it's kind of
how do we
distracting.
change that though? And I mean, in terms of an educational perspective, how do we get a society to recognize it's because I believe that, and I think a lot of the Romanian orphans feel that there's a lack of accountability from Romania acknowledging what happened and how to move forward from that. And I think if you look across society, basically what you had just mentioned in regards to accountability through politicians, if there was that sense of accountability, would that benefit the culture and allow the culture to basically move on from that identity in communism?
Look, I think, we don't have to invent the wheel. Romania has made mistakes, other countries have made mistakes. What have other countries done? They've done the recognition of the mistakes and apologies. I think, for children who are failed because, and again, another thing was that so many children left the country who shouldn't have left the country. Romania ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990. It should have, if you go by the law, you have to respect that. A lot of children were in suitable care, either in foster care or in suitable institutions or in families, shouldn't have left the country. So it should acknowledge those mistakes. The system, like I explained, it was so complex that you can't really get it right, which is why the right answer is protect your children, don't export them. And plus the identity issues we've discussed, which I think are still to be uncovered by research.
Hmm.
So I think if you start from that conversation, let's have it. Let's have that conversation
Yeah.
with you guys because you are, human beings in your full rights, um, telling your stories and posing that question. I think that question will need to be addressed in a restorative manner. We need to have a conversation and yeah,
And
and an
that's why I do
apology.
this. Yeah, and that's why I do this. And it's not necessarily because I think that it'll patch things up, but what it does is it allows Romania to take on an image of being responsible for its own people. And we consider ourselves Romania's people, whether we grew up in Canada, UK, Australia, wherever it may be. The common consensus with these adopted Romanians is that there's an identity and we are, and you can't change that as respective Romanians. And when we go to Romania, the general population seems to agree with us on a
Yeah.
massive majority. It just, I think, when leadership decides to take that leap of um, humility, really, humility,
Hmm.
you
Yes,
know,
I agree. I
humility
agree.
to say, hey, this is what happened. It was a stressful, it was a extreme time. A lot of bad things happened. We acknowledge that these bad things happened, but this is not a nationalistic, but a self-determined effort to move to a better place, and it can be used as a platform even. And that's where I'm just so shocked that there's a lack of leadership in addressing this sort of notion, because that could be used as a springboard for
Mm,
a new start and a next page in, and it's reflective for the entire society and their moral compass and interest in participating in Romanian
mm.
society, politics, unions.
Yes, I agree. But I know these things. You obviously know it because you are placed where you are. You've started this community, this group. I did research, but I think, there isn't sufficient knowledge out there. And I think there is, perhaps either anxiety or shame about this. And people still want to think, oh, no, this is the right thing for the children. And it really, hopefully, the research I did and your narratives will make their way.
And
Um,
I hope we bridge that. Honestly, I hope we can make that bridge because I've said to so many adopted Romanians, I say, what's done is done, but what we can do is change the future. And so many people are stuck in the past and they struggle to
mm,
understand that you're just going to get angry. Depression, all
mm,
these different things
mm,
come about
mm,
when you're stuck in the past, and you can't change it. But what you can change is how we move forward. And
mm,
I love the fact that you're actually willing to come out here and publicly speak about this because it's a very difficult issue to have anybody speak about. And that is that narrative. We had a movement in Canada called Bell Let's Talk. And the Let's Talk movement opened up the doors for people to talk about mental health. And now mental health is a everyday household conversation. I
mhm,
think it's 10 to 15 years old. So if we could have that sort of discussion um, about the difference between, like you said, before 1999 or 2000 range and the progressions that have been made, it can change the the media narrative internally and externally because we know
mm.
that the internal narrative isn't any better. It fuels the
Yes.
external narrative.
Yeah.
Then it creates a conversation that we can use individuals like your research to say, look, we've got people in big places that can
Mm,
help fuel these conversations and get them started. But we need to open the doors enough to say, hey, we trust that, Romania's interest is in mind, but also that
mm,
having the right talks and the right direction push forward is the potential outcome. And I don't know how we bridged that because how do we convince people that, especially before, say, that generation passes on, how do we convince them to understand that we're not looking to go after anybody, we're just
mm.
trying to make life better for everybody.
Well, I think it's a process, isn't it? And this conversation. I hope is part of that process. And I think I may have sent you the link. I recently had discussion about the book which was hosted by the Romanian Cultural Institute, and that was um, together with a historian. I think more people will look into it, and there are things which can be done to raise it with politicians. Now, England, where I live, there were children sent to Australia back in the 1960s until early 70s. Again, children who were vulnerable from very poor families. And it was only in 2012, after some research was done, and some of them, those who grew up in Australia, and many of them being abused and so on, and being lied that their parents had died and they had no family. When they started to trace this, uh, when the country issued an apology in 2012, which was quite recent. So this is not to discourage anybody, but it's just rather to be patient and build the case as it should be, like you have framed it now, and
Yeah,
build that case. Yeah.
I understand that. I mean, there's a timeline and a process. I think maybe one of the most discouraging things and one of the biggest things that people were concerned about with what we were doing today was, and I got about 6 or 7 messages about this, was how are we going to make things look? And that to me was just such a strange question, because when we talk about how we make things look, eh, why does it matter what the house looks like on the inside or the outside? What really matters is what the house is doing on the inside, and does it have a bed? Does it have people to sleep in there? Does it have food for people? And
Mm.
to me, it's like you can take that superficial imagery from the outside and say that everything's okay, but if there's nothing inside that, uh,
Mm.
we can't really address anything. And when we talk about Romanian society and the disconnect they have from their expats alone, not just, I think we can make a correlation, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong,
Mm.
a correlation between, oh, my dog, a correlation between expats and the way they live and have a disconnect from Romania today, to the orphans and the lack of initiative from Romania internally to draw people back in.
Yeah, I think we live in an increasingly divided world, not just Romania, but I think, there is a lot of division all over the place. I mean, look at Brexit, look at lots of other sort of, the elections are always, all these elections where have very close results, but very different and passionate views about what is the right thing. And there is now more and more talk about the need for humanity, the need for compassion, the need for trying to understand the other's perspective, rather than this fear. I can understand that some people, might feel threatened by an approach of justice, feel. Also, you have to think that it in Romania alone, it became a sort of stigma. It became associated with the country, the sort of the children issue, with everybody saying, what is right. It's just it's. I often see countries or nations like individuals having certain features, and which play out differently in different contexts. So uh, and this issue of children in institutions was very much an issue of image, and the image which was perpetuated was often wrong.
Hmm.
It displayed certain institutions, certain images in a certain way to fit into a specific narrative, whether it was for fundraising purposes, or it was to promote adoptions, which was, it was somewhere, it was some money behind the narrative, which is
And
often the
I
case.
see that being completely possible, because if you look at the African narrative, with children
Mm,
have flies fly around their face, and then you speak to somebody from say Lagos, and they're worth $65 million, and they kind of just laugh about it, because it's like we're not some World Vision kid type thing. And you know I think when we have that discussion, it points out, yes, this was a narrative that's been created and portrayed, but can we have initiatives that are in place to change that narrative? And not only that, with that becomes a community that evolves like an individual. Like as you mentioned, country can act as if they're an individual, on behalf of individuals, and produce uh, a new rhetoric, a new
mm,
persona, a new uh, aspiration. The American dream, when that started to die, America was dying. And can is there a potential for Romanians to come together and recognize these things, and then say, we're only as strong as our weakest.
Yes, but I think to get there, I think it's very important that your stories come across, because for people to understand, to kind of gauge what happened, they need to understand what happened in the long run, because the narrative is this is the best for the children, and it still is. I think for a lot of people, they just see it that way. I think that's a pretty um, ignorant way to look at things, but you can't blame people for being ignorant or for not being educated enough, because their lives are different. They don't do the same job I've done for 20 something years.
Yeah, and that's another thing, right? Like you mentioned earlier, people have a different level of education, and if you go back to, say, the average worker in Romania, or the or a young person that never even heard anything about this sort of thing, the first thing that people typically do is they identify with their things that are meaningful to them, and they'll end up in denial of those things, and then you end up in a conflict of interest or a power struggle. And when we talk about these things, it's coming from a compassionate position. And sure, there were an abundance of horrible situations that, I mean, of course there was organ trade. Of course, like you can't deny that those things happen anywhere where there's a crisis. Uh, that's what happens in crisis. People take advantage of those situations. But I kind of look at it as we kind of need to get those individual, like you said, stories and people
Mm,
to recognize that, it happened to human beings, but it's okay that those things happen. It's not okay that those things happen. It's just we have to be okay with it,
mm,
because in order to move forward, we have to understand that yes, things happened,
mm,
and now we've got to figure out how to make amends and make up for those things.
yeah. Yes, absolutely. And well, I think, for example, um, in 2009 and 10, I think the Committee on the Rights of the Child in Geneva recommended Romania to resume intercountry adoptions, overlooking why they were stopped in the first place, let alone the fact that it's not something which the Convention on the Rights of the Child encourages, really. It almost excludes it completely. So, yeah, uh, I challenged that in an article I published a few years ago, saying that actually went against the provision of the Convention on the Rights of the Child when they made that recommendation, like and I was pleasantly surprised to see a few years ago um, that the claim I made in my article was used in a commentary which was published by Oxford on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it's how we interpret the convention these days. So you see, it's drop by drop and contributing to a larger and understanding and working hard and honest.
That's the
Um,
tough part, right? Because there isn't much funding for this sort of endeavor, and when you start to inquire, there needs to be somebody that either has honest intentions to fund these sorts of projects, or you end up with non-objective, I guess, methodologies and producing that data. And I kind of, when you talk about the rights to the child, the rights to the child, I think back to, it was only about 20-25 years ago that in Canada they actually, I think it was early 80s, uh, or late 80s. The, regardless, dogs and animals got rights a couple years before children did. And
mhm,
the fact that this sort of thing happened in a Western country, and natives didn't get rights, and to this day still don't. So we need to obviously be objective in the way we look at things, but at the same time, obviously we see the struggles and looking, having foresight. So why can't a country take care of those children? And what can be done? Canada has an initiative that was just signed about a year or two ago where Native children and their families would be shipped off to, uh, say, like a resort, and they would work out their problems. And there was a funding set aside for it because they realized that we were funding 100, $200,000 a year for each child, and the children were ending up in jail, dead, or addicted to
Mm-hmm.
drugs and
Mm-hmm.
unemployed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
why was this happening? So they started to realize, you know what, we need to start getting the Native community involved, and we need to
Yes.
work with the cultures and the personable approaches of each individual and say, you know what, look, yes, you're not doing the right things in this regard, but we can help you get there. And that hands-on approach needs to be recognized, and I support your decision to do that because it needs to be recognized that you can't just pass a bill and flowers grow from the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. But absolutely. But it's the same process is happening right now in England. In Scotland, it's amazing. I think it's a sort of revolution what happens there because the first minister empowered uh, care experienced people to do a review, an independent review of the care system. And they're implementing it now. They use the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In England, it's also a very strong care experienced community. It was only 2 years ago, but they got together 150 people between, I don't know, 16 and 82 years old, all
Wow.
ages, being surprised that the same issues which were generations ago still continue in the current care system and trying to change it. I think it's not far until we see these changes happening because it's just there is more education and people do acknowledge and people do study, um, not just psychology but philosophy and maybe the human rights framework in school and think about things. So there is one thing which is permanent, and that's not adoption. It is change.
Hmm.
So I keep hope that I think there are some groups which serve as peer groups for the adoption community, for those adopted internationally, in particular from Romania or from the other countries. And I believe that change is happen, and probably adoption will be reframed differently. And there is discussion about that in England. That's not even international adoption. That there is more and more acknowledgement. There is a lot of good intention out there to get it right for children. There is less knowledge of how we get it right, but I think there is research now which starts to give us a look or access into the black box of care through the voices of the young people.
And it's interesting you say that because, for example, in the Canadian system, they have an American system. They have a foster care system that is on large and large, extremely unsuccessful. And one of the interviews that I had done, uh, the young woman said, I went into foster care homes and it was the worst experiences I've ever had in my life. And then I've also seen cases where there are caring individuals, but there needs to be a standard beyond the documentation of signing on the dotted line and providing funding because you need to know exactly where that funding is going to, how to facilitate it. And I think maybe that's a starting point, and you can't just produce a bill and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to stop adoption or we're going to start it. You need to have that
Mm.
that body of people come together and evaluate all potential options and opportunities and treat it like a business, really. Like you
Mm,
come in and you say, okay, so in first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, how are we going to facilitate our business? What are the obstacles we can have? How are we going to develop different projects? What happens if we go through a recession? What happens if we have this breakdown or that? And once you have that full picture, you can at least refer to it and be like, hey, this is what we had kind of mind mapped at that point, and we
mm.
have these resources available.
I think we need to start from children's needs. I think there is plenty of research which tell us what children need, and I think the responses are obviously, to some extent, depend on economy, on culture, and the same country can respond differently at different point in time. I mean, Ceausescu responded in one way, then the 90s responded in a different way. But if we have a sort of moral philosophy and framework,
Hmm.
um, how as a society we respond to most vulnerable children and have that acknowledgement of what it is that they need, because the thing about adoption is that it provides stability, and of course children need stability. It also has the challenge on um, identity, and all these things you can only produce, sort of. First of all, there isn't one size fits all, it, and that's the same for children, because what works for a child may not work for another child. It's the same with carers. A foster carer could be a brilliant foster carer for a child but be a horrible one for another child, and they came across that situation. So we need to underpin our moral principles really well, and each culture responds in a different way, and perhaps Romania would have had more better or more foster carers 20 years ago. It would have less now because so many people emigrated for the children in care. So I can't see. I think the only way to get this right is to really involve people like you into what
Uh,
the issues are.
and when I look at it, it's like human rights in Geneva have good intentions based on the documentation, but like, having the ability to enforce it is the tough part. And I think if we look at, say, situations such as the current conflict in Palestine, which is quite
Yes,
popular right now, we
yes.
see there's been a rhetoric since 1948 that they've been saying, like, this is not appropriate, this is not appropriate, we need this to stop. And
Mm-hmm.
nobody's actually, when you create those groups, look at what they did for COVID. They created a body of doctors and people to facilitate instructions and research, and look how much success they had in doing so. Imagine they were
Mm-hmm.
able to do that in other realms of human rights.
I agree, and it should be through cooperation, and it should be through dialogue. And people who hate each other need to, yeah. So there is no other way.
And I don't say that people hate children, but I do believe
No, no,
that
no, no, no. I didn't
there's
mean that.
there isn't a voice for those children, and that's why I made that analogy. And if we can, based on knowledge that we have, create a system that doesn't just isn't just applicable, as you mentioned, to Romania, but globally, but is modified to each situation based on their needs, then you end up getting into situations like, what do they want? What do you want to be able to do? Because the needs are obviously not being met in Canada. 25 to 30% of kids uh, don't have food. You got it across the world, and there needs to be an initiative where funding towards causes that are.
And the nice thing about the convention is that it's something which was negotiated by almost all the countries. They had experts or people from the government for 10 years. They negotiated, they compromised, they came up with that instrument. And that instrument from 1989 I think, has some good principles. And now each country has to take it serious and think how they can put those principles in place. And I think, it has to, children have to be important. We are talking about aging population, about global threats, the way we treat children, the planet, everything we can mess up with just because we're grown ups. We have just to understand and stop doing that.
And it almost becomes commercialized in today's day and age, and that's the unfortunate part, because we've got individuals such as yourself. Like, how many times has the Romanian parliament referred to you to talk about, and I just mean a random phone call where a politician says, I've got Miss Neagu on the line, and I'm going to ask her a question about what we can do. And she's going to grab a few people that's going to say, hey, like, this is the best way to go about things. It's almost like they go into a room with nobody else in it, and they decide to make decisions that don't necessarily consult the people that
Mm,
have spent their whole lives trying to help and work towards it,
mm. It
or
takes
bettering.
time. Yes, but I can only be hopeful. And why is that? Because I grew up during communism. I was a student when communism um, ha- collapsed. So I lived through that change. And I know that things can be terrible, but I also know that things which are terrible somehow, sometime are going to change. And I believe in that. So
So
we need
in
to keep working on it.
I love that approach and the positivity, because it doesn't place blame on anybody. It just says, like, change is gonna be what prospers, and it always does, regardless if it's positive or negative. It ends up being what where we go. I think in closing, my big question at this point would be, how do we as a community, in collaboration with uh, great people like you, get that platform, that research opportunity, that ability to say, look, like, we've got the people, we've got the volunteers, we've got the opportunity to do something great here, that maybe you might not see financial rewards at the end of it, but
Mm.
there's a moral and a real foundation there that can be built for not just Romanian societies to reference, but everybody. How do we
Well,
get there?
we need to get our heads together, I'd say, and this is a beginning. But uh, there are many good people out there, and I know a lot of good people who'd love to get involved. And I think one side effect of the pandemic is a sort of realization of for people of what is important. I know people who go back to Romania. Travel has become more difficult these days. So, and that's a conversation we didn't have had, I don't know, 16 months ago. Yeah, before the pandemic happened. So, yeah, we need to think about it. And I'm sure, we can, change happens, we can only contribute to it.
So I'm gonna go on the record right here and ask you, uh, should we form some sort of think tank group that can come up with um, some potential uh, ways to research, get that knowledge out there, collect the data, obviously, and attract people that want to help. Because if there's no place for them to come to, then there's no place for them to go.
Mm, mm. Um, yeah, I think that's one way of doing things. But it's. I remember a conversation I had about a year ago when I was discussing with a friend who grew up in Care in England, and we were talking about the changes which are needed here. He and he told me, I spin my plates, and when you come and you spin your plates, and it's like one gives energy to the other, and they keep rolling. And I think this is how I see the big change happening. I don't think it happens overnight. I don't think we're gonna have a magic wand, but at the same time, I think I'm aware now of uh, the interviews you've done, you've posted. For sure, I'll have them in mind when I'm going to think about how to make my research known to other people. Um, it's a cooperation, and whether you want to call it a think tank, and want to think about formulas of doing it, I'm happy to help. That's why I've worked on it for so long, and
And
yeah,
that to me is the real um, beauty in people coming together and having a place to do so, because and obviously the internet these days, because we're able to uh, whether someone sees this and they're Romanian or not, there's an opportunity to identify and say, hey, there's consistencies across our people. There's consistency with the behaviors, the maybe this thing happened somewhere else and we weren't aware of that one either. And all of a sudden, like you said, there's a snowball effect that kind of, well, I'm in Canada, so we snowballs, right?
yeah,
Snowball effect where people start to understand that, it's okay to talk about it, and that'll create a narrative where we can all come together. And I want you to, just before we end here, to maybe speak about your book and what what's going on with your book, and what you want to accomplish with it quickly.
right. Okay, so it's coming out in at the end of July. It's called Voices from the Silent Cradles, but I actually call it the black box of child care because it's what people have said about foster care, residential care, and adoption. And I think all of them are challenged to some extent by the young people I've spoken to. I hope it's going to be, Romania will understand. Maybe one day we'll think about translating it. We shall see. Um, what I aim to achieve, I think it's going to, because it's not my merit, but because it brings a unique group of people speaking about different types of care. It helped me enormous um, to understand what is happening, and now I feel that I can. I'm a good expert in child protection. I don't think I was. I thought I knew a lot, but now I know so much more. I expect to have an impact, I hope, for other people in the field, not necessarily related to Romania. And I speak about policies and the discussions we are having about bringing care into the moral domain. Yeah, I
Are you
think
speaking on
that's.
a European level or global level?
Um, like I said, child protection I think is local and cultural, but I think people who have an interest about what do we do when we take children from families, what does the state, or what should the state do to behave as a good parent? I think, yeah, anyone in any country could read it. There are very powerful quotes from the young people, and that's, I think, the beauty of the book, and other ideas about policy.
One of my favorite people in the world is Noam Chomsky, and he didn't start in any sort of in political or sociological sphere. He was obviously more of a logician to some degree, and he, even though that's where he made his initial name, I think what he's most famous for is the humanitarian side of him. And uh, I think a researcher is a researcher, and the further detached you can be from personalizing it, almost makes you a better researcher. So that, I think, makes this, for you, especially with your bold presentation, to attack issues that and research issues that are, attack's the wrong word because you're researching, it's neutral, to basically come up with data and an opportunity for others to join the narrative. And I
Mm-hmm.
think you're going to become a pioneer in this uh, field because it's still young.
Mm. I think it's a lot. It's what they say in research. It sheds light, and it sheds light by displaying those narratives and showing people, oh, you can think about it this way, and yeah, and that's how we evolve at the end
And
of the
you don't
day.
have a leg in it, and that's why I had you on today, because you don't have money in it. You don't have any sort of, you can come on here and this could be the end of your career at Oxford if you said something that somebody disagreed with. So this is the sort of thing where you don't you're doing it out of your own personal compassion and humanitarian beliefs, and it's something that you identify with on a on that level, and not obviously say like an individual exponential level,
Mm,
because I kind of I look at you and I think this is the start of something that's going to be much bigger than
mm,
uh, Romania, uh, than child development. It's going to be the start of human beings appreciating everyone regardless of where they're from, what they do, and what's wrong with them, in the sense that, do they have a disability? Is there any issues underlying
mm,
what caused it? Uh, and you end up opening those doors.
mm.
And I really appreciate that.
I think I had a huge privilege, and I'm lucky. I discovered that there are things in life which are so valuable, and they have nothing to do with money, and they're not money. And money, to some extent, is irrelevant. What I've learned from these people, and I want to share that richness of life experience and what life is about. I think if we can make people understand those things, we'd have less corruption, perhaps, because I think there is a lot of unhappiness in corruption in people who have that greed, that drive of having what you don't have: money, children, cars, whatever it is. And I would like to, from the beauty and richness of that life experience, that people learn and maybe change
It's so
themselves for
humbling.
better.
It's so
Mm,
humbling because when you think about creating framework for people to say, I can still make my money, but I can do it the right way, is
mm.
a real initiative that is going to be like an artist that doesn't see their work until after they're dead.
I know, I'm married to an artist.
Okay.
Anyway, it's been lovely to meet you.
You too, and I definitely want to talk about your book when it's released, because I think we can actually speak specifically. I'll read it and we can go through uh,
Yes,
details and go on to that page of things, because there's a lot that needs to be done in this, and the more we speak about it, the more people, one person, every person that sees it is another person that now knows.
exactly. I'll sure enjoy that conversation. Thank you so much, Brendan, for having me.
Thank
It's
you.
wonderful to meet you.
And if anybody wants to ask comments, I'll get answers from you in the comment sections. Uh, for me, I just want to have a professional such as yourself have that opportunity to reach out to every single individual, and for them to get information from the right sources. So thank
Absolutely.
you.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.